Welcome you all to this late afternoon European time, much later East, and your time earlier day session. Well, now we welcome William Snyder for the University of Connecticut. It's about children's syntax. Okay, I would like to say a few words. During my times as a student, syntax was everything. I mean everything. It was language, deep structures, surface structures, transformations, logical forms. From syntax derived everything. Okay, worthless to study anything else but syntax. That was my time. Okay, before my time, I found a little bit, it was not syntax, it was phonetics, phonology, and morphology. Later came syntax. At this time, acquisition. What was acquisition? No idea. Somebody might talk here and there in language pathology department, social life, but we at Linguistics and Phonetics, we had nothing about language acquisition. Here we have William, who will combine those two, but I must say, I haven't counted, but acquisition and teaching languages and so forth, for today, for this conference, it is most of the papers. So it's a good subject, and William is a very good example for all of us to hear. Please, William, the word is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And let's see, I hope all of the technology works for us. My plan for today is to tell you about some of my own work over a number of years. And the focus will be on changes, how the child's grammar, syntax in particular, morphosyntax perhaps, how that changes in the course of child language acquisition. And my belief is that the time course of child language acquisition is an extremely valuable source of information, both about the process of language acquisition and about the nature of what the child is acquiring. So more about that as I go on. And I should say that I'll be touching on lots of things, too many things probably. And I hope that people will ask me to elaborate on anything they'd like me to. I'm very happy to in the question period. So the general scheme for the talk today, 3 case studies, and each will illustrate a particular property. For the purposes of this talk, I've called them, the ideas that the changes in the child syntax are decisive, additive, and interconnected. And I just made those terms up for today's talk. I'll try to explain what I mean by each of them. And also I should mention at the outset, in some of my work, I've talked about the idea that children's acquisition of syntax involves what I've called grammatical conservatism. And essentially, decisiveness and GC, or grammatical conservatism, are the same thing. The upshot of all of it will be that I think we're led to say that what the child is acquiring is parametric information about grammar. But I'll elaborate on that a bit at the end, and I'm happy to elaborate more on it if people would like me to. So by parametric, I have in mind something like a principles and parameters approach to grammar, but not just any principles and parameters approach will do to account for the acquisitional patterns I'm about to describe. So we'll look at that at the very end. So first off, first case study, I'd like to look at children's acquisition of verb particle constructions in English. So this will be evidence that changes in the child's grammar are decisive. What I mean by decisive is that the child is maybe best described in contrast to some natural expectations. We might expect that the child would approach the adult grammatical system by a process of successive approximations with lots of errors along the way, maybe even a trial and error approach. So if we assume that the child is guided by biology to some space of possible grammars for adult human languages, even with that much structure, we can still imagine the child's process of language acquisition is going to be one essentially of trial and error, and there are plenty of models of that kind that have been proposed. But in contrast to that, the idea that I have in mind when I say that the child's grammatical changes are decisive, is that the child is going fairly abruptly from not using some structure available in the target language to using that structure essentially correctly. So let me show you what I mean. Actually, before I show you what I mean, so the strongest statement of this idea in my work is where I've spelt out the thesis of grammatical conservatism, the idea that children don't make productive, spontaneous use of a new syntactic structure until they've actually determined that the structure is allowed in the adult language and worked out why it's allowed, what the grammatical basis for it is. So that's quite a strong thesis, meant to be so, to permit progress as we demolish it, perhaps. But for today, I won't demolish it. We'll see some evidence to support it. The basic, the primary form of support for this idea comes from the error patterns, though. In contrast to what we might expect if children were going through a process of trial and error or successive approximation or what have you, in contrast to that, the overwhelming majority of children's spontaneous errors involve omission, not commission. In other words, the children leave things out all over the place, leave things out that would be required in the adult language, but it's relatively unusual when we actually count, when we do quantitative analysis, to find the child is putting things together in ways that are simply impossible in the target language. I mentioned that it's easy to get the impression that things are otherwise because there's a natural selection bias if we are simply looking at transcripts of child speech. The commission errors that are there grab our attention. They set off alarm bells in our head. It's only when we plan out a careful quantitative study that looks at the opportunities for such errors in relation to the errors that occur, that we see this is the exception rather than the rule. So I'm not actually by any means the first person to make this point. In fact, in particular, I'm impressed by the work of Michael Maratzis, who's talked about this as underground acquisition, the idea that the child works industriously underground, figuring out the grammar, and then when she has arrived at a solution, she ventures to use that point of grammar in her own speech. That's the idea of underground acquisition. It's very much the same idea. And let's see. Yeah. I should avoid being misunderstood here. So I don't want to say that children never make errors of commission. That would be false. But I do want to say that for the most part, for most types of commission errors, they're happening in a very small percentage of the environments where they could in principle happen. So even at their peak frequencies, most error types are occurring up to perhaps 5% of the time when they could occur, but not much more, not any more than that, often much less than that, even if they're very striking when we do hear them. There are a few exceptions to this. So, for example, morphological overregularization errors, such as in children acquiring English, we hear things like singed in place of sang. And those occur somewhat more frequently than the 5% mark, although not as much more than that as some would have you believe. Even there, but let's grant that those are a bit more frequent. Also, errors in the family of what people have called root infinitive or optional infinitive utterances. And I have actually a good bit more I could say about those and what's special about them if people would like me to. But for the moment, let me just observe that there are a small number of types of commission errors that do occur with somewhat greater frequency, but they're a tiny subset of the logical possibilities for commission errors. Let me also note very carefully that what I'm talking about here is children's spontaneous speech. So naturalistic observation of what children do when they are totally free to talk about whatever they'd like. In that case, if the child doesn't yet know how to construct some type of utterance, she has the opportunity to, well, she has the options of using a circumlocution, changing the subject, using, well, one important option is to omit structure, omit portions of the structure about which she is uncertain. On some cases, the child might really be determined to express one particular meaning and not have a way to do it. And on those occasions, you will get errors of commission. But usually in spontaneous speech, children have other options and they take those other options. So in a sense, it's telling us that the children know what they don't know. They know how to do certain things, they don't know how to do others, and they know the difference. In studies of elicited production, in contrast, where the researcher is in the lab and effectively specifying the meaning that the child must express to comply with the task, then we get errors of commission all over the place. So, and arguably we get some phenomena akin to that in controlled studies of comprehension, although it's a little less clear. But the key point for me is that when we look, this pattern seems to be right for spontaneous speech, and that's sufficient to lead us to certain conclusions about the nature of what the child is acquiring and how she's doing it. And let's see if I can. There we go. So if this is right, and again, even if it's restricted to spontaneous speech, the strong conclusion it leads us to is that the child is actually engaged in what is sometimes called deterministic learning, to use a term from Robert Berwick's work. The key idea is no backtracking. The child doesn't explore possible grammars, discover that they're wrong, and then backtrack from them. Because if she did, the inevitable result is easily detectable errors of commission, and they're just not, even in spontaneous speech, and they're not there where they should be. So that's the logic. Now let's look at the actual example or data. which comes from chapter 4 of a book I published back in 2007. And in this chapter, kind of exercise, I did a near exhaustive search for errors with the English verb particle construction in the longitudinal corpus for the child known as Sarah, one of the corpora collected by Roger Brown in the 1960s. And I chose Sarah's corpus for this purpose because at that time, and I believe even at the present, it's the densest publicly available corpus for a child acquiring English. It spans ages from 2 years, 3 months to just over 5 years, and with a mean gap between recordings of just, I believe it was 7.3 days. And in fact, it's much denser at certain points when a lot was happening in Sarah's development, in the opinion of the researchers. So they collected as much data as they could when they saw that it was relevant. So it's a very rich corpus for us to look at if we're trying to find, what errors occur as the child is acquiring some point of grammar. What does it look like? I should also mention that the verb particle construction in English is used frequently by adults when they're speaking to children or when they're speaking to each other, and also used frequently by children once they acquire it. So it's a good thing to look at if we're studying spontaneous speech data. It's a place where we can see a marked difference between the child not using the structure and the child using it, because it's used frequently once the child does begin to use it. And Sarah was not using it at the beginning of her corpus. It's something that she acquired during the window of recordings in her corpus. So the starting point, I mentioned that if we simply look for things that catch our attention, what will catch our attention is errors of commission. If we want an accurate idea of which ones actually occur and how often they occur, and we need to do a planned search. And what I did at the beginning of this exercise was figure out, well, what are the logically possible types of error that might occur? And in the case of English verb particles, we have in mind things like Mary stood up, verb stood plus particle up. An intransitive case, we can look at transitive cases like Mary lifted the box up, where we can have a full noun phrase, the box, a full DP, or a pronoun, proform, it, Mary lifted it up. We can also have the order with the particle intervening between the verb and the direct object in English. So Mary lifted up the box. Notice that a learner relying on simple analogical reasoning is likely to be tempted into saying something like Mary lifted up it. And yet that's grammatically impossible. But the search conducted here was designed so that it would certainly catch that if it ever occurred. Another logically possible error type would be using two particles, using a particle before and after the direct object. And that would be a tremendously useful thing if we had it in English. Mary lifted up the box out. She lifted the box up and out. Okay, but she lifted up the box out. No, impossible, sadly, because it would be useful if we had it. Another possibility logically would be things like Mary lift up the box, where the past tense marking is placed on the particle rather than the verb. And still another possible error we could imagine would be something like Mary uplifted the box, or Mary has the box uplifted, which is impossible in present day English, but is actually possible in quite a few of the other Germanic languages spoken today. So it's a natural error type to be interested in. And the search that I conducted here was designed to catch not just the adult-like forms, but a variety, these and other error types that I can imagine, including guessing all the different ways that a transcriber might have reacted to hearing one of these error types. So any way that it could possibly have been transcribed, I tried to capture in the search. What are the results? Well, here I've shown a graph with the transitive particle constructions for Sarah. I've just plotted the correct forms in the squares, blue squares, if you can see that, and the errors of commission in red triangles. And what you see is that the commission errors stay down near the bottom throughout. The x-axis is in ages in months, so I've grouped together the transcripts for a given age, and the y-axis is frequency per 1,000 utterances by the child. And what you should see, though, is that we go from the child using none of these particles, transitive particle constructions, to a point at which, right at 30 months, 2 years, 6 months, where they begin to appear. We also get a few commission errors around that time. And what I've sometimes called a geyser effect, just a few, begins to appear, and there are additional uses, in fact, involving a variety of lexical items, boom, boom, and then it explodes. So model of a geyser that follows some pattern of that sort. For the intransitive particles, a very similar picture, although there are a few near misses early on. There's a sort of an inflection point at 30 months where it starts to take off and then really takes off. And once again, the errors of commission are very, very few. So the errors almost always took the form of omission, not commission, from the beginning of the corpus through age 2 years, 10 months. So going out an additional 4 months beyond the first few uses. Sarah produced 102 verb particle constructions in her corpus, and there were 32 of them contained an error, but at least 29 of those were errors of omission. Here I've been conservative and counted anything that could possibly have been a commission error as such. But the one clear, honest to gosh, unambiguous commission error is I go downed at the age of 2 years, 10 months, so not one of her first uses, but it is a case where she seems to have put the past tense marking on the particle rather than the verb. But in conclusion, I think it's fair to say Sarah made a rapid transition from never using the construction to using it in an adult-like fashion with almost no errors of commission. Let me speed up a little bit, I think, better. So case study 2 concerned prepositional questions, and here the property that I'd like to illustrate is what I've called additive or additivity. The idea is that it's actually similar to the first property, but showing that the child might even go through a period of not being able to express certain meanings at all with her grammar at present, and even in that situation, not make the commission errors. Basically, the child refraining from speaking even when it limits her communicative power. So the study here is one that I conducted with Koji Sukisaki, and we were looking at prepositional questions. This is a place where different languages have different options. Whatever option one might choose, it's going to be, or whatever option a language might choose, it will be a wrong choice for some other possible languages of the world. It's a place where we should find easily recognizable errors of commission if they are occurring. And Koji and I were interested in particular in whether there might be some kind of a default option that children would use until they had figured out the right option for their language. This is a good place for for something like that to exist. And we can see this if we simply look at English and Spanish. So that's what's given on the slide here. So English is somewhat unusual across linguistic terms in having preposition stranding. So what is he talking about, where we've stranded the preposition at the end. We can also marginally say something like about what is he talking, although it often sounds quite odd and it's virtually absent from spoken English. In contrast, if we look at a language like Spanish, de que habla, of what or about what is he speaking, we call this pied piping. If we try to strand the preposition que habla de, that's just incomprehensible as Spanish. So what Koji and I did in this study was get 4 high-quality longitudinal corpora for Spanish, 10 for English, and hand-searched all child utterances containing a preposition to locate all attempts at a prepositional question. And in short, what we found was first, neither pied piping nor p-stranding was employed until the child had determined the correct option for the target language. And so the children acquiring English did not ask prepositional questions until some point at which they suddenly started asking p-stranding questions, which just like the adult. Similarly, for the child acquiring Spanish, you get no prepositional questions until a certain point when the child suddenly starts using pied piping questions, just like the adult. In addition, at least 4 of the children acquiring English were clearly going through an extended period when they seemed to be avoiding prepositional questions. So I've tried to illustrate this with a simple diagram here, sort of timeline. For each of these children, for all of the children, we located a point at which the child had begun to ask direct object questions and also had begun to use the declarative counterparts to prepositional questions, so verbs with prepositional phrase, complements or modifiers, and then for the same, for each child, figured out at what point the child began using prepositional questions. And for 4 of the children, the gap was statistically significant by binomial test in terms of the number of uses of direct object questions before the first use of a prepositional question. So for these children, it ranged from 2 to 9 months with a mean of 5.2 months, where the child was using the declarative counterparts to prepositional questions, but never asking the questions. There were the number of direct object questions sampled during this gap ranged from 11 to 48 with a mean of about 30. As soon as prepositional questions appeared, however, they were almost as frequent as the direct object questions. So our interpretation is that for a time, the child's grammar was providing a structure for the direct object questions, but not providing any structure at all for prepositional questions. And the key point was that the children during this time were not even attempting P questions. At some point, there was a subsequent change to the child's grammar that added prepositional questions to the child's grammatical repertoire. Finally, just a little bit of time I think I have, looking at the interconnectedness. And here I'm looking at compound word formation and complex predicates. In fact, the complex predicate, one type of complex predicate that I'll be interested in is the verb particle construction once again in English. But let me say the first point of variation here across languages, one that I'm interested in, concerns compound word formation and the observation that in some languages like English, this is we could call a creative process. So in English, for example, we can say lab space for space where we construct a laboratory, or lab space committee for a committee that makes decisions about allocation of lab space to professors, or a university lab space committee, and so on. English is a language where we can freely create new compounds like this, bare stem compounds, and expect a listener who has the relevant contextual background to understand us and accept this as good English. We tried this in a language like Spanish, regardless of word order, comité, espacio, laboratorio, universidad. It's just a bunch of nouns strung together. What we have to do in Spanish is put in prepositions to get something more like committee for space, committee on space for laboratories in the university, something of that sort. So this is a point that the child has to acquire. I should mention that although Spanish doesn't allow creative compounding, it does have a reasonable number of lexicalized noun compounds, things like hombre lobo, literally man wolf for a werewolf. But it's the creative part that is missing. And what I found in a long line of work is that a number of so-called complex predicate constructions seem to be found only in languages that have creative compounding. You can see this for Spanish versus English again. So you try to do a particle construction like Mary pulled the top off. In Spanish, Maria tiró el tapón, fine, but for off, de, it's not clear what you would use. There's nothing you can use as a separated particle there. Likewise for adjectival resultative constructions, things like John beat the iron flat, Juan golpeó el hierro plano, so Juan golpeó el hierro, John beat the iron, fine, and el hierro plano, it can mean the flat iron, John beat the flat iron, but if you're trying to say John beat the iron until it became flat, you just can't do that in Spanish. And based on some small-scale cross-linguistic investigation, I found that there are languages like the ones on this slide that do not allow creative compounding and also do not allow the adjectival resultatives or the separable particles. There are languages that allow all of them from a range of language families. There are a few, like Japanese and ASL, that allow adjectival resultatives and compounding, but not the separable particles. I can talk more about that if you'd like. But it seems that any language that I've been able to find that has either the adjectival resultatives or the separable particles also has creative compounding. Noun is usually the most freely available type of compounding, if any type is available. So that's what I talk about here. Now, looking at child language acquisition, I'm going a little over time, I see. We can, again, look at longitudinal corpora spontaneous speech to find out at what point the child discovers these aspects of, in this case, English. I've also did work on this on German, but we can talk about that more later. The age of acquisition here is taken as what I've called age of FRU, first of regular uses. And we saw a little bit of that with the verb particles earlier. There's some point at which the child has a first clear use that is followed soon after by regular uses with a variety of different lexical items. And that first of regular uses is the index I use for the point at which the child's grammar was clearly changing. And what you get if you plot age of FRU for novel noun compounding, compounds where the child has invented it, versus the age of FRU for verb, noun, phrase, particle, what we get is something very close to an identity function. This was with 10 children. Correlation was exceptionally strong. I did a larger study in the 2007 book with 19 children, got very much the same pattern. You can do partial correlations, removing various control measures like MLU as a measure of general language development, lexical noun compound as a control for novel compounds, adjective noun combinations as a control for the conceptual complexity of a modifier head combination, whatever, the relationship is still very strong. And so at this point, I should really start to wrap up, and I'm nearly on my last slide here. So we've seen evidence for decisive, additive, and interconnected changes in the course of child language acquisition. My interpretation is in some sense parametric, but what does that mean? So broadly by parametric, we mean any grammatical framework in which there are a limited number of choice points, and for each choice point, a limited number of options. And finally, where the choice points are abstract, not closely tied to specific surface grammatical forms. That's the idea anyway that I have in mind as parametric. You get interconnectedness that way, yes, because the choice points are abstract. You get decisiveness, not necessarily. You could, but you also might not. And likewise for additive characteristic, unless you're talking about subset parameters, where each parameter has sort of an unmarked option that allows a more restricted set of structures, and then a marked option that expands that inventory of structures that are permitted. And one proposal of this kind that I'm fond of, at least, is the idea that the parameters of syntax could be, or what we might call constructive parameters. It says that they serve to add new structure building operations. And that would give us interconnectedness, decisiveness, and this additive property. I'll be happy to expand on any of that in the time remaining if people would like me to. Thank you.
Thank you, William. Now we can accept questions. Please raise your hands. Michael, please. Mikhail.
Yeah, thank you. This was really interesting. So thanks a lot. I have two questions actually. So one would be, you focused in the first part of the talk on spontaneous speech. And I was wondering to what extent spontaneous speech may not reveal contemplated hypothesis, so competence, right? In the sense that grammaticality judgment tasks might reveal with older participants, or elicited production might reveal. So whether the fact that the child does not produce certain constructions is a marker of their not contemplating that, or whether it may be, for instance, that they are contemplating the possibility, but the processing load doesn't allow that, or some other factors intervening, so that you don't observe that in spontaneous production, but they are actually in the interlanguage syntax. And my other question would be whether you'd say the same constraints hold for second language acquisition in children or bilingual language acquisition.
All great questions. So to start with the first one, I think that it's exactly right that basically each method of investigating child language acquisition gives us different kinds of information about what's going on in the child's head. So for one thing, I think that the child, that standard observation that comprehension usually precedes production is almost forced upon us by learnability considerations. The child must be able to figure out to a good approximation what the adult means at least some of the time in order to have any hope of figuring out the grammar of the target language. It means, though, that at least the findings that I've reported here suggest that the child is making a sharp distinction between grammars that are possibilities at a certain point versus a grammar that the child has made a commitment to. So it seems that the child might be entertaining a number of possibilities or agnostic on certain points for purposes of comprehension. But when it comes to production, what I'm led to think is that the child at a certain point makes a commitment to one or another choice. And then as soon as she's made that choice, the child seems to have the courage of her convictions, sense of actually using whatever that might allow. So that's, I think, why we see both the novel compounding and the particles. In fact, it's interesting to watch the children when they discover novel compounding. They will, in some cases, teach a novel compound to the parents if the parents don't immediately understand them. So I can tell you more, but anyway, now all of this is just, though, is going to be observable with spontaneous speech data only insofar as we're looking at structures that are used frequently once they're acquired, and that often means that they're relatively low in their processing demands. If we were interested in something that had relatively high processing demands, one approach might be to have a control measure where we'd predict, okay, at a point when the child has the evidence of the grammatical prerequisites for this and evidence of the processing capacity to use it, at that point, at least, we should see this form. If we still don't see it at that point, something is wrong with the hypothesis. Now, anyway, so that's the nature of my reasoning here. In terms of second language acquisition, either in adults or childhood or bilingualism, wonderful questions, and I'm not a specialist in those areas, so I would be thrilled to see more people in those areas looking at the counterparts to what I've done here for those populations to see what is happening. I could speculate, I guess, on some possibilities, but I think really it's an empirical question what happens there. So I hope people will take the initiative, take the my encouragement to go out and find out more.
Thank you.
Time for...
Okay, Marco, Michael, are you done?
Yeah.
Okay, Marco, please, your turn.
Hi, thank you for your lecture. Very interesting indeed. I was wondering whether in your first case study, the children show omission of some correct structures too. Mm-hmm. Like, for instance, the Mary lifted up the box. Those structures kind of show some irregularity across the category, pronoun, noun. So I was wondering whether they appear later, just this curiosity of mine.
So let me be sure that I understand. So let me first, let's see, go back to the area there. But you have in mind, so Mary lifted up the box.
Are those frequent as well?
Okay. So there is an ordering effect, and this is something that actually I've published work on in collaboration with Karen Stromswold some years ago. The observation actually goes back to Roger Brown, that children acquiring English, well, I think the right way to describe it is sometimes they get lift the box up and lift up the box at the same point in time. But if these two are acquired at different ages, the one that comes first is always lift the box up with the particle at the end. And that's been examined by a number of people, including by Karen and me, with various longitudinal corpora. It seems to be a strong effect. There are children who get the two right at the same point, but when there is a difference, it's lift the box up first. On average, we find a gap of about 2 to 3 months between lift the box up and lift up the box.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, it's, I think, a really interesting and important pattern that is still waiting to be fully explored. So it needs to be worked on more.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm afraid we don't have time for another question. If you have a quick one, we could accept one more. If not, we can go to our next subject.
Okay.
Now, can you come
Judy?
back, please?
Yes, okay. Yes.
I think we have William here, and if I might ask for some 5 minutes more and extend the other presentations, is it possible?
If it can be short, because everyone is on a schedule.
Because later we have a break, so we can take 5 minutes from the break.
What do you have in mind onto this?
Yes, well, it's once upon a life we have here. Well, this about syntax is if it's everything or whatever. Well, I think with your exams, what are you talking about? And I lifted, so I think it's a prefabriqué. The child has to learn these things, these boxes, how to combine. And he or she can't combine them otherwise, because otherwise it's wrong. It's not distinctive, which means if you put about at the beginning, it means something else. So syntactic variability, for the most, is not distinctive, right?
Do you mean that the meaning?
It has no effect on meaning. Syntax is either wrong or right. If you change the syntax, you don't change the meaning. Well, in most languages, or usually. Now, my question is, like phonotactics, they come like this. You don't plan phonotactics. If you decide to say university, it goes directly. You don't plan, which consonant vowel, okay?
Right.
They are low level. I have a feeling that syntax function the same way. The children have to learn a lot of structures. And my question now is, how free is syntax? Because according to my view, syntax functions within a context, a prosodic context in the first place, and a communicative. We talk in order to communicate. So you have to set this frame to provide your lungs with air, your muscles, and so forth. Otherwise, you have false starts. And once you have done those things, then you put your syntax with a little of freedom.
Well,
what do you say about this?
Yeah, one thing that I think is worth keeping in mind here is the comparison came up earlier between child language acquisition versus adult foreign language acquisition. So if we look at the if we want to know the range of possible errors that a human learner could make, one source of insight is from adults trying to learn a foreign language. And then we get errors of, well, we get the kinds of errors you would expect if the priority is on communication and getting the point across. Often, as you were suggesting, actually, the meaning can get across even if the grammar isn't perfect. So the question becomes for me, why doesn't the child make why doesn't the child make the same sorts of errors that an adult foreigner who's a beginning learner of the language makes? Do you see my point?
Well, thank you, William. We have really enjoyed you. Thank you very much indeed. And I hope we will have more opportunities in the future to talk about those interesting things. Thank
I would
you
love
very
that.
much indeed. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Antonis.